In the long and winding chronicle of human thought, few ideas have stirred the mind as deeply as the belief that life does not end with death, but moves onward in another form. From the earliest records carved into stone to the manuscripts preserved in monastic libraries, the notion of rebirth appears again and again, refusing to fade into silence. Ancient civilizations, separated by seas and centuries, spoke in remarkably similar language about the soul's return, as if history itself were whispering a shared memory. What follows is a journey through time, shaped in the manner of historical narration, where evidence, testimony, and tradition combine to present accounts that have left scholars astonished and skeptics unsettled. In the sacred texts of ancient India, composed more than 3,000 years ago, rebirth was not presented as myth alone, but as a law woven into the moral fabric of the universe. The Upanishads describe the soul as a traveler, changing garments as easily as the body sheds age and decay. This belief did not remain confined to scripture. It shaped social conduct, justice, and philosophy, influencing generations who treated life as a chapter rather than a conclusion. That such a detailed system arose so early suggests an idea born not merely of imagination, but of observation and reflection. Across the ancient world, Greek thinkers grappled with similar questions. Pythagoras, whose name echoes through mathematics, was remembered by followers as one who claimed recollection of previous lives. Plato, writing in the 4th century before the Common Era, recorded dialogues in which the soul's return was debated with seriousness rather than scorn. The tale of Er, placed at the end of the Republic, described souls choosing new lives before returning to the world, a narrative framed not as fantasy, but as moral instruction grounded in reason. In Egypt, where death dominated architecture and ritual, inscriptions reveal a belief that life continued beyond the tomb. While often associated with the afterlife rather than rebirth on Earth, certain texts hint at cycles of return, particularly among priestly traditions. The meticulous preservation of bodies was not only an act of reverence, but preparation for a journey believed to continue in forms not fully understood by the living. Moving eastward, Chinese records from the Zhou dynasty reveal early notions of ancestral return. Though later Confucian thought emphasized lineage and memory, folk traditions persisted in which children were said to bear the spirit or fate of those who had lived before. Such beliefs survived dynastic changes, suggesting a resilience rooted in lived experience rather than imposed doctrine. Medieval chronicles offer another layer of intrigue. In parts of Europe, particularly Ireland and Wales, stories circulated of children who spoke of other lives with unsettling clarity. These accounts were often recorded by monks, cautious writers who framed the tales as wonders rather than doctrines. Despite religious opposition to rebirth, the persistence of such stories in official records implies that witnesses found them difficult to dismiss. One of the most striking patterns found across centuries is the testimony of young children. Historical accounts from Asia, the Middle East, and later colonial records describe children recalling names, places, and events unknown to their families. In many cases, such details were later verified through local investigation. These reports were not confined to one culture or era, lending them a weight that challenges simple explanation. Physical marks have also entered the historical record. Certain birthmarks and deformities were believed to correspond with injuries from a previous life. In Sri Lankan chronicles and later in documented cases from the 19th and 20th centuries, such marks were treated as signs rather than coincidences. Physicians of the time, though lacking modern terminology, noted the patterns with curiosity and unease. Language itself offers another thread of evidence. Accounts exist of individuals speaking unfamiliar dialects or ancient tongues during trance or dream states. In historical contexts where travel was rare and education limited, such occurrences raised profound questions. Scholars debated whether these were instances of forgotten learning or echoes of earlier existence, a debate that remains unresolved. Dreams, long regarded as messages from beyond waking life, were considered by ancient historians as possible windows into former lives. Roman writers described dreams so vivid and detailed that they seemed more like memories than imagination. Such dreams often carried emotional weight, suggesting personal experience rather than symbolic vision. The persistence of reincarnation beliefs among indigenous cultures further strengthens the historical case. Among Native American tribes, Australian Aboriginal communities, and African societies, rebirth formed part of oral tradition long before written history arrived. These cultures, isolated from one another, shared similar narratives of return, recognition, and continuation. Historical opposition to reincarnation is itself revealing. Religious councils in late antiquity debated and ultimately rejected the doctrine, not because it lacked followers, but because it conflicted with emerging theological structures. The need to suppress an idea often indicates its influence and appeal, suggesting that belief in rebirth was widespread enough to demand formal denial. In the modern age, historians and researchers have revisited old accounts with renewed interest. Archives once ignored now attract study, and patterns emerge when cases from different centuries are placed side by side. Though history cannot provide laboratory proof, it offers something equally powerful: continuity. When an idea survives thousands of years, crosses cultural boundaries, and reappears in the testimonies of ordinary people, it commands attention. Taken together, these 15 strands of historical evidence form a tapestry that is difficult to unravel. They do not demand belief, but they challenge dismissal. History, often regarded as the record of what is known, here becomes a mirror reflecting questions still unanswered. In tracing these accounts across time, one encounters not a single voice but a chorus, speaking softly yet persistently, suggesting that life may be far more enduring than a single span between birth and death. From the earliest traces of human civilization, the belief that life continues beyond death in another form appears not as an isolated idea, but as a recurring conclusion reached by societies that never knew one another. Long before global contact or shared philosophy, distant cultures developed remarkably similar explanations for existence, all pointing toward the same central conviction: that birth and death are not final boundaries but moments within a much larger cycle. This universality is what makes the idea of reincarnation historically striking, for it suggests not imitation but independent realization shaped by human experience itself. In ancient India, the concept of rebirth was embedded deeply into philosophical thought, rather than treated as a superstition. The earliest Vedic hymns already hinted at continuity beyond death, and later texts such as the Upanishads articulated the soul as eternal, moving from body to body as part of a moral order. This belief shaped daily life, ethics, and governance, creating a worldview in which actions carried consequences beyond a single lifetime. The precision and depth of these teachings indicate a long period of reflection, suggesting that reincarnation was not a sudden invention, but a conclusion refined over generations. At nearly the same time, ancient Greek thinkers were grappling with similar questions. Philosophers sought to understand the nature of the soul, its origin, and its fate after death. Pythagorean tradition spoke openly of transmigration, the movement of the soul through successive lives, and these ideas influenced Plato, who treated reincarnation as a serious philosophical possibility rather than poetic imagination. In Greek thought, rebirth was tied to moral learning, implying that the soul returned to complete unfinished lessons. The emergence of such ideas within a culture renowned for logic and debate challenges the assumption that reincarnation belongs solely to mysticism. In ancient Egypt, a civilization obsessed with death and eternity, the journey of the soul was central to religious life. While the emphasis lay heavily on the afterlife, certain texts and rituals suggest a cyclical understanding of existence. The soul's components were believed to separate and reunite, and some traditions hinted at return rather than permanent departure. The monumental effort invested in preserving the body reflects a belief that life, in some form, was not finished. Even if reincarnation was not expressed in identical terms, the underlying assumption of continuity remained strong. China presents another independent development of the same idea. Early Chinese thought blended ancestor reverence with spiritual continuity, producing beliefs that ancestors could return through descendants or influence the living directly, while later philosophical systems focused on harmony and order. Folk traditions preserved stories of rebirth, particularly among children who were believed to carry the spirit or fate of those who came before. These ideas existed long before the introduction of Buddhist influence, suggesting that reincarnation-like concepts were already rooted in cultural understanding. Beyond the great civilizations, indigenous cultures across the world held strikingly similar beliefs. Among Native American tribes, oral traditions spoke of souls returning through the family line, sometimes recognized by behavior, talents, or memories. Australian Aboriginal cultures described life as a continuous cycle connected to the dream time, where birth and death were movements within an eternal pattern. In parts of Africa, communities believed that newborns often carry the essence of ancestors, recognized through signs, dreams, or physical traits. These societies, separated by oceans and millennia, arrived at comparable conclusions without written scripture or shared philosophy. What makes this universality historically significant is not merely the presence of belief, but its function. Reincarnation served as an explanation for inequality, talent, suffering, and moral justice. A child born into hardship or exceptional ability was not seen as favored or cursed by chance, but as continuing a story already in motion. This interpretation gave meaning to randomness and comfort in loss, offering a framework that connected past, present, and future into a single narrative. The recurrence of reincarnation beliefs also reveals something about early human observation. People noticed patterns in personality, memory, and behavior that could not be easily explained by inheritance or environment alone. When a child displayed knowledge or tendencies disconnected from family influence, rebirth became a rational explanation within the limits of historical understanding. Rather than dismissing such phenomena, cultures integrated them into coherent belief systems. Even linguistic evidence supports this universality. Words and phrases describing rebirth appear indently across ancient languages, each shaped to fit local worldview yet expressing the same underlying idea. This linguistic convergence suggests that reincarnation was not imported wholesale from one culture to another, but arose naturally wherever humans questioned the nature of existence. The persistence of reincarnation beliefs across time further strengthens their historical weight. While empires rose and fell, religions evolved, and philosophies shifted, the idea of rebirth adapted rather than disappeared. It survived in mainstream doctrine in some regions and in folklore or mysticism in others, demonstrating a resilience uncommon among purely mythical ideas. Beliefs that lack experiential grounding often fade, yet reincarnation endured. When viewed through the lens of history, reincarnation stands not as an exotic or fringe concept, but as one of humanity's most widespread responses to the mystery of life and death. Its presence across continents, civilizations, and social structures suggests a shared intuition about continuity, one that emerged wherever humans paused to reflect on memory, identity, and meaning. The sheer breadth of this belief challenges the notion that it arose from coincidence or cultural borrowing alone, pointing instead toward a deeply rooted human perception that life, in some form, has been lived before and may be lived again across the long span of recorded history. Accounts of lives remembered beyond a single birth have appeared not as isolated curiosities, but as observations carefully preserved by chroniclers, philosophers, travelers, and religious scholars. These testimonies, scattered through manuscripts, temple records, court history, and personal letters, reveal that the idea of recalling former lives was taken seriously enough to be written down, examined, and debated. In many cases, the writers themselves expressed hesitation or caution, yet felt compelled to record what they had witnessed, suggesting that the events challenged their own understanding of reality. In ancient India, historical testimony went beyond philosophical speculation and entered the realm of lived experience. Early Buddhist and Jain texts include narratives of individuals recalling previous existences with remarkable detail. These were not presented as allegory alone, but as examples meant to illustrate moral continuity and spiritual development. Monastic records preserved such stories as part of historical memory, treating them as occurrences worthy of documentation rather than imaginative storytelling. The consistency of these accounts across different schools of thought points to a shared acceptance of their authenticity. Greek historians and philosophers also left behind written testimony that reflects a cautious respect for the phenomenon. Plato, while known for abstract reasoning, referred to recollection of prior existence as a concept rooted in observed human behavior. Later writers such as Plutarch recorded anecdotes of individuals who displayed knowledge or emotional attachments unexplainable within a single lifetime. These accounts were often framed as mysteries rather than proofs, yet their inclusion in historical works reveals that they were considered part of the intellectual landscape of the time. Roman historians, though generally skeptical of metaphysical claims, nonetheless preserved reports of extraordinary memory and identity. Certain biographies mention figures who believed themselves to have lived before, sometimes recalling specific details that aligned with known historical events. While Roman authors often refrained from endorsing such claims, their decision to include them suggests that the testimonies were widely known and discussed rather than dismissed outright. In the medieval period, when theological doctrine often rejected the idea of rebirth, historical testimony did not vanish but shifted form. In Ireland, Scotland, and parts of Scandinavia, monks recorded stories of children who spoke of other lives, former families, and distant villages. These accounts were usually framed as marvels or divine mysteries, allowing them to exist within a religious worldview that otherwise denied reincarnation. The careful language used by these chroniclers indicates an effort to remain faithful to observation while avoiding doctrinal conflict. Travelers' records from the Islamic Golden Age provide another layer of testimony. Scholars and explorers moving between regions documented local beliefs and extraordinary cases they encountered. Some described individuals who claimed detailed memories of previous lives, including occupations and social status. While these writers often attributed such phenomena to the complexity of the soul, they rarely dismissed them as fabrications, suggesting that the witnesses appeared sincere and credible. In East Asia, historical testimony emerged through court records and local histories. Chinese dynastic chronicles include accounts of children who recognized former homes or spoke of past identities. Such stories were often investigated by local officials, whose findings were recorded with bureaucratic precision. The involvement of authorities lends these testimonies a level of seriousness uncommon in purely folkloric tales. Japan's historical literature also contains accounts of rebirth recognition, particularly within Buddhist contexts. Temple records preserved cases in which monks or villagers identified individuals believed to be returning figures from the past. These records were maintained for centuries, indicating an institutional willingness to preserve testimony across generations. With the expansion of global travel in the early modern period, European missionaries and colonial administrators encountered reincarnation testimonies in Asia, Africa, and the Americas. Many of these observers, trained in skeptical or doctrinal frameworks, nonetheless documented what they saw with notable detail. Letters and reports sent back to Europe describe children recalling names, events, and relationships that were later verified by local inquiry. Though often accompanied by expressions of doubt, the factual tone of these records suggests that the observers found the testimonies difficult to explain away. By the 19th century, the rise of historical documentation and early scientific inquiry brought renewed attention to these accounts. Scholars began collecting cases systematically, comparing testimonies across cultures and time periods. Historical journals and private archives contain hundreds of such reports, often accompanied by witness statements and verification attempts. While conclusions varied, the accumulation of testimony itself became a historical fact that demanded consideration. What distinguishes these historical testimonies is their persistence, despite changing intellectual climates. In eras dominated by spirituality, rationalism, or scientific materialism, accounts of past life memory continued to surface. Each generation interpreted them through its own lens, yet the core phenomenon remained strikingly consistent. Names, places, emotions, and unfinished lives appeared again and again in the historical record. The presence of these testimonies in formal historical sources, rather than solely in myth or legend, gives them particular weight. They were recorded by individuals whose purpose was to preserve events, customs, and observations for posterity. Their careful wording, contextual detail, and occasional expressions of doubt suggest an attempt to remain truthful rather than persuasive. Across centuries, the written record reveals a continuous thread of human experience that resists simple explanation. When historians encounter the same type of testimony in ancient manuscripts, medieval chronicles, and modern archives, separated by vast distances and cultural boundaries, the repetition itself becomes significant. History does not confirm belief, but it preserves evidence of belief shaped by observation, and in doing so, it leaves behind a trail of testimonies that continue to provoke reflection on the true nature of memory, identity, and the passage of life through time. Among the most striking patterns found in historical records is the repeated appearance of young children, who spoke or behaved as though their lives had begun before their birth. Across centuries and civilizations, these accounts follow a remarkably similar structure. A child, often between the ages of 2 and 5, begins to speak spontaneously about another life, naming people, places, and events unknown to the family. What gives these testimonies particular weight in historical study is not only their frequency, but their consistency across time, geography, and culture. Ancient texts from South Asia contain some of the earliest references to such childhood memories. In early Buddhist literature, children who recalled previous existences were sometimes brought before elders or monks to examine their statements. These narratives describe children speaking with emotional intensity about homes, relationships, and deaths that did not belong to their present circumstances. The seriousness with which these cases were treated suggests that they were not seen as childish fantasy, but as phenomena requiring understanding. Similar accounts appear in ancient Greek sources, where philosophers observed that children sometimes displayed knowledge or emotional responses far beyond their age. Plato discussed the idea of innate knowledge, suggesting that learning might be a form of remembering rather than acquiring new information. While framed philosophically, such discussions were inspired by observable behavior in children that seemed difficult to explain through ordinary experience alone. In medieval Europe, despite official theological resistance to the idea of rebirth, records of children recalling other lives continued to surface. Monastic chronicles from Ireland and parts of Britain describe children who spoke of former families, occupations, and villages. These stories were often investigated by local communities, sometimes resulting in visits to the places named by the child. Chroniclers carefully recorded these events while avoiding direct endorsement, presenting them as wonders that challenged established understanding. Historical records from China provide particularly detailed examples. Local gazetteers and dynastic histories describe cases where children identified former homes, recognized relatives of another family, or recalled specific events from a previous life. In several instances, local officials were involved in verifying claims, documenting whether the child's statements matched known historical facts. The bureaucratic nature of these records gives them a level of credibility uncommon in oral tradition. Japanese temple archives also preserve similar cases, particularly within Buddhist communities. Monks documented children who claimed to be reincarnations of deceased individuals, often former religious figures or respected villagers. These records include descriptions of the child's behavior, speech patterns, and recognition of objects or locations linked to the earlier life. The institutional preservation of such accounts indicates that they were considered significant enough to maintain over generations. Indigenous cultures across the world offer parallel evidence through oral history. Among certain Native American tribes, children who spoke of other lives were believed to be returning ancestors. Elders carefully listened to such children, sometimes identifying the deceased individual whose life the child described. These traditions were passed down orally long before written documentation, yet when later recorded by anthropologists they revealed patterns consistent with much older historical accounts elsewhere. In parts of Africa, similar beliefs existed among communities that held strong ancestral traditions. Children who displayed unusual knowledge or personality traits were sometimes recognized as carrying the spirit of a deceased relative. These identifications were not made casually. Elders compared the child's behavior, preferences, and statements with the remembered life of the deceased. Such practices, documented by early travelers and historians, demonstrate a structured approach rather than random belief. One of the most compelling aspects of childhood past life accounts is the emotional depth they often contain. Historical records describe children expressing grief for families they believed they had lost, fear connected to remembered deaths, or longing for places they had never visited. These emotional responses were often intense and persistent, distinguishing them from imaginative play. Observers across cultures noted that such emotions appeared genuine and difficult to dismiss. The age-related nature of these memories also appears repeatedly in the historical record. Many accounts note that the memories faded as the child grew older, often disappearing entirely by adolescence. This pattern was observed in ancient texts, medieval chronicles, and modern documentation alike. The consistency of this fading process suggests a phenomenon with recognizable characteristics rather than isolated coincidence. Another recurring feature is the specificity of the information recalled. Children often mentioned proper names, geographic details, and personal relationships that were later confirmed through investigation. Historical writers frequently emphasized these verifications as they distinguished the accounts from vague or symbolic claims. The emphasis on detail reflects an attempt by observers to assess credibility rather than promote belief. Skeptical interpretations have always existed, and historical sources acknowledge them. Some writers suggested that children absorbed information unconsciously, while others attributed the phenomena to dreams or spiritual influence. Yet even skeptical authors often admitted that certain cases resisted easy explanation, leading them to document rather than dismiss what they observed. Across centuries, the repetition of these childhood accounts forms a pattern that historians cannot easily ignore. When similar behaviors, ages, emotional responses, and verification methods appear in records separated by vast distances and time periods, the phenomenon becomes historically significant. It suggests a recurring human experience that challenges conventional assumptions about memory and identity. The presence of such accounts in formal historical records, rather than solely in folklore, underscores their impact on the societies that recorded them. Chroniclers, officials, monks, and elders chose to preserve these stories not because they were entertaining, but because they raised profound questions about the nature of life and continuity. Through the lens of history, childhood memories of previous lives emerge not as isolated curiosities, but as a persistent and puzzling element of human experience that has echoed through generations and cultures alike throughout history. Observers have noted that certain individuals enter life bearing marks, fears, skills, and memories that appear disconnected from present circumstances yet strangely aligned with experiences from another existence. These physical and psychological signs have been recorded across cultures as possible links to lives lived before, forming a category of evidence that has fascinated historians, physicians, and philosophers alike. Unlike spoken memories, which can be questioned or forgotten, these marks and behaviors often persist, leaving visible and measurable traces that demand explanation. Ancient medical texts from South Asia contain early references to unusual birthmarks and bodily features believed to reflect experiences from a previous life. Physicians of the time observed that some children were born with scars, missing fingers, or distinctive markings that resembled wounds described in past life accounts. These observations were not treated casually. They were discussed within medical and philosophical frameworks that sought to understand the relationship between the body and the enduring soul. Similar ideas appeared in ancient Greek thought, where philosophers speculated that the soul carried impressions from one life to the next. Plato suggested that experiences left deep marks on the soul, influencing both character and bodily form. Later writers noted cases where individuals exhibited unexplained fears or talents, proposing that such traits might be remnants of earlier experiences rather than products of the present environment. In medieval Europe, despite theological resistance to rebirth, chroniclers still documented cases of individuals born with unusual marks or exhibiting intense fears without apparent cause. Some children displayed terror of water, fire, or weapons despite having no traumatic experiences in their current lives. Observers sometimes linked these fears to stories of violent deaths associated with the individual believed to have lived before. These records were often framed cautiously, yet the recurring pattern compelled documentation. Historical accounts from East Asia provide especially detailed descriptions of physical correspondences. Chinese local histories mention children born with marks that matched injuries sustained by deceased individuals in the same region. Officials sometimes compared descriptions of the marks with known records of deaths, noting similarities that could not be easily dismissed. The fact that such investigations were conducted by bureaucratic authorities rather than storytellers adds weight to the historical record. In Japan, temple records include cases where physical traits or habits were considered evidence of return. Children who instinctively performed religious rituals or demonstrated advanced skills without training were sometimes believed to carry knowledge from a former life. Monks documented these behaviors alongside physical observations, preserving them as part of institutional memory. Psychological patterns form another significant strand of historical evidence. Individuals throughout history have displayed intense emotions connected to unfamiliar places, objects, or professions. Some were drawn inexplicably to certain regions, while others exhibited aversions that shaped their lives. Historians noted these tendencies when they aligned closely with known details of another person's life, especially when no social or familial link existed. Unexplained talents have also been recorded across centuries. Children who displayed extraordinary musical, artistic, or technical abilities without instruction were often believed to be continuing unfinished work from a previous existence. In historical contexts where education was limited and talent rare, such abilities stood out sharply. Writers documented these cases as marvels, sometimes attributing them to divine favor, yet often acknowledging the possibility of continuity from another life. Language and speech patterns provide further psychological evidence. Historical records describe individuals who used unfamiliar dialects, archaic phrases, or technical vocabulary without formal learning. In some cases, these speech patterns corresponded with regions or professions associated with the life they claimed to remember. Such occurrences puzzled observers who lacked a framework to explain unconscious learning or genetic memory. The relationship between physical marks and psychological memory is particularly notable in historical accounts. Some children not only bore birthmarks resembling injuries, but also expressed fear or emotional distress connected to those marks. Observers across cultures noted this connection, suggesting that body and mind carried linked impressions from earlier experiences. Skeptics in every era proposed alternative explanations. Some attributed birthmarks to maternal imagination, others to chance or hereditary factors. Psychological traits were sometimes explained as temperament or upbringing. Yet historical writers often emphasized cases where these explanations seemed insufficient, especially when multiple correspondences appeared together. What distinguishes these accounts historical? Why is there repetition and consistency? Physical marks linked to remembered injuries, fears aligned with traumatic deaths, talents connected to unfinished work, and emotional attachments to unfamiliar places appear in records from widely separated cultures. The recurrence of these patterns suggests more than coincidence within the historical imagination. Medical and philosophical debates surrounding these phenomena evolved over time. In early periods, explanations leaned toward spiritual continuity, while later thinkers explored psychological inheritance or subconscious memory. Yet regardless of interpretation, the phenomena themselves continued to be observed and recorded, forming a continuous thread through history. The endurance of such evidence across changing intellectual climates highlights its impact on human thought. Even as scientific understanding advanced, reports of unexplained marks and psychological patterns did not disappear. Instead, they were reinterpreted, examined, and sometimes dismissed, but rarely ignored entirely. Within the historical record, physical and psychological signs stand as some of the most tangible and unsettling forms of evidence related to rebirth. They confront observers not through belief alone, but through visible and emotional realities that resist easy categorization. Across centuries, these marks and memories have continued to raise questions about the boundaries between body, mind, and the possibility of lives extending beyond a single lifetime across the long course of history. The idea of rebirth has shown a remarkable ability to endure, even when confronted by powerful institutions determined to suppress or replace it. Beliefs that fail to resonate with lived experience often vanish quietly, yet reincarnation persisted through centuries of religious reform, political control, and intellectual transformation. This survival itself forms a compelling historical pattern, revealing how deeply rooted the concept was within human consciousness and social structure. In the ancient world, reincarnation existed openly within philosophical and spiritual traditions. Yet as organized religions began to solidify authority, certain ideas were selected for preservation, while others were condemned. Historical records from late antiquity show intense debate over the nature of the soul and its destiny. Councils and scholars argued over doctrines that would shape religious identity for generations. In several traditions, reincarnation was gradually declared incompatible with official theology, not because it lacked followers, but because it challenged centralized interpretations of judgment, salvation, and authority. Despite formal rejection, the belief did not disappear. Instead, it retreated into folk traditions, local customs, and private reflection. Medieval Europe provides clear evidence of this transformation. While official doctrine emphasized a single life followed by eternal reward or punishment, stories of rebirth continued to circulate quietly among the population. Chroniclers recorded them as marvels, legends, or mysteries rather than doctrine, allowing them to survive beneath the surface of orthodoxy. Historical suppression often intensified curiosity rather than extinguishing belief. When religious authorities labeled reincarnation as heretical, they also acknowledged its influence. The need to condemn an idea publicly suggests that it had gained enough acceptance to pose a challenge. In this way, opposition itself becomes evidence of endurance, revealing how widespread and resilient the belief had become. In regions where reincarnation remained part of accepted doctrine, such as South and East Asia, its survival took a different form. There, the belief adapted to philosophical refinement and social structure. It became intertwined with ethics, governance, and education, shaping how individuals understood responsibility and destiny. Dynasties rose and fell, yet the concept of rebirth remained woven into cultural identity, surviving invasions, political upheaval, and reform movements. The spread of global exploration during the early modern period brought these differing attitudes into contact. European travelers, missionaries, and administrators encountered societies where reincarnation was openly discussed and widely accepted. Their writings reveal a mixture of fascination, confusion, and resistance. While many rejected the belief on doctrinal grounds, they still documented its prevalence and the seriousness with which it was treated. These records demonstrate that reincarnation was not a marginal idea, but a central component of many cultures. The Enlightenment introduced new forms of opposition rooted in reason and empirical thinking. Philosophers questioned all metaphysical claims, including rebirth, demanding observable proof. Yet even in this climate of skepticism, reports of past life memories and unexplained phenomena continue to appear in historical documentation. The persistence of such reports during an age hostile to spiritual explanations highlights the resilience of the underlying experiences that inspired belief. As science advanced in the 19th and 20th centuries, reincarnation faced renewed scrutiny. Material explanations of consciousness left little room for the survival of the soul. Nevertheless, historical records show that interest in rebirth did not fade. Instead, it shifted into new forms of inquiry, with researchers collecting and comparing cases across cultures. The belief adapted, finding expression in psychological, philosophical, and cultural studies, rather than purely religious doctrine. Political opposition also played a role in shaping the belief's endurance. In some societies, authorities discouraged reincarnation because it undermined social control or threatened hierarchical order. If identity could extend beyond one lifetime, rigid social divisions lost their permanence. Yet even under such pressure, the belief persisted in private thought and family tradition, resurfacing whenever restrictions eased. One of the most telling aspects of this endurance is how reincarnation repeatedly re-emerged after periods of suppression. Ideas truly disconnected from human experience rarely revive once erased, but belief in rebirth resurfaced again and again, often in times of social uncertainty or moral questioning. During such periods, the idea offered continuity, justice, and meaning beyond immediate circumstances. Historical literature reveals that reincarnation often survived through storytelling rather than doctrine. Myths, legends, and personal testimonies carried the idea forward when official institutions rejected it. These stories preserved the core concept even as surface interpretations changed. Over time, the belief adapted to new cultural languages while retaining its essential structure. The endurance of reincarnation also reflects its ability to coexist with competing worldviews. In some societies, it existed alongside belief in an afterlife or divine judgment, rather than replacing them entirely. This flexibility allowed it to persist without demanding exclusive allegiance, making it harder to eliminate completely. Across centuries, the survival of reincarnation belief despite religious condemnation, philosophical skepticism, and scientific opposition reveals a pattern rare in intellectual history. It suggests that the idea was not sustained solely by tradition or authority, but by recurring human experiences that continued to inspire reflection. History shows that when an idea consistently reappears after every attempt to erase it, its endurance becomes evidence in itself, pointing toward a deep-rooted human perception that life's story may not be confined to a single beginning and end across the long record of human history. The idea of reincarnation stands not as a fleeting belief or cultural curiosity, but as a persistent response to the deepest questions of existence. Civilizations separated by oceans and centuries reached similar conclusions about the continuity of life, recording testimonies, observations, and experiences that challenged the finality of death. From ancient scriptures and philosophical debates to childhood memories, physical marks, psychological impressions, and the survival of the belief despite intense opposition, the historical evidence forms a pattern too consistent to be ignored. History does not demand certainty, but it reveals repetition, and repetition across time often signals a truth still unfolding. When the same accounts emerge again and again, carried by ordinary people rather than imposed by power, they invite reflection rather than dismissal. In this light, reincarnation appears not merely as belief, but as a question written into the human story itself, asking whether life truly ends, or whether it simply changes form and continues its journey beyond the limits of memory and time.